Before we talk about the effect of the two world wars on missions, I want you to tell me what you know about the two world wars. What brought about those wars and what happened? Anybody? Yes? Okay, so who started these wars and why? And just any little bit of information. Yes? Okay. And the Germans were involved in both the First World War and the Second World War. I'm not exactly sure why Germany keeps popping up that way, but that was the case on both occasions. The second one having been, in fact, the more infamous chancellor, and that is Adolf Hitler. If anybody today is called Hitler, I think he'll get wrong attention for himself. Okay. And then how did the war itself continue or grind to a halt, or anything that particularly sticks out to you in your own mind concerning either the First or the Second World War? And notice that they more or less lasted the same period, 5 to 6 years, which again is amazing because there were two totally different wars. But it looks like in the fighting, somewhere in the 4th to 5th year, the formula is, or people's patience runs out, and then they come and put everything now to the destruction of the chief agitator. But anything that you recall? Yes? Yeah, and they got so involved that America dropped the infamous bomb on Hiroshima after having, what were those guys called who were suicide bombers? Kamikazes, yes, going to bomb, especially Pearl Harbor, is a typical point in history. Yeah, but finally, they came round to Hitler himself, and he committed suicide at the very end. Yeah, thank you. Has any of you ever visited any of the concentration camps? Yeah, I visited one of them in Germany. It makes your hair stand on end. You say to yourself, how can human beings do this to fellow human beings? It's one thing if you are fighting and somebody does something terrible to you in the midst of a fight. I hope I won't lose my train of thought, but I remember once in America being interviewed by a Christian on Nelson Mandela, and I was saying to him that Nelson Mandela is a hero in Africa, and this guy could just not take it. And he kept saying to me, but he's supporting abortion. And what was the other thing he said? He was a terrorist. Yeah, he was a terrorist. And I kept saying, I don't justify his party's endorsement for a lot of the wrong policies, but in terms of finally getting South Africa to be free from white domination, there's no doubt he will still be a hero to black people until, long after he's dead. And he kept bringing back the terrorist thing, and I kept saying, and this is the point, I was saying, it was a fight So when two people are fighting, you can't just say, but why did you kick him in the face? When people are fighting, they all tend to lose the sense of, I might damage him permanently. They're just now angry and they're doing things towards each other. So we don't justify it, but you can understand if one country is fighting another country is fighting back. But the Holocaust, the Jews were not fighting somebody. So for somebody to come up with an oven and then to be lining them up and just roasting them alive, and to be in a place where it was actually happening, it just blew my mind. So, yeah, there was the Holocaust that took place prior, well, even during the World War itself. Hitler continued to bust them in, to bring them in by trains and get rid of them. Yes. Yeah. And that was 4 or 5 years down the line, as I said. It's like they said, guys, we can't continue like this. Let's go in. And they lost a lot of men, but they won the war. Okay, so we all learned about the First World War, we all learned about the Second World War in our history books. Therefore, in talking about the 2 world wars here, I am not going into that history at all. What I am doing is talking about the effect on missions, the effect on missions. And first of all, because Germany was a culprit in both wars, it meant that their missionaries were hindered. The missionaries who were in countries or regions that were under other countries were suspect. They were treated like spies. And so it became very difficult for them to function. And then there was just the anti-German atmosphere, that made it extremely difficult for them to function as well. And unlike what I would call English names that have spread worldwide, German names are still very much German. So you can't miss who a German is by his name. And therefore, the missionaries that came from Germany, even just by their names, they were finding it extremely difficult. In fact, some of the missionaries were actually banished out of the countries in which they were working. They were removed altogether. So the missionary work under Germans was hindered. Number 2, in fact, number 2 and number 3 are fairly similar, so let me put them together. African men were recruited to go and fight. You remember I mentioned my great-grandfather, or is it grandfather? No, great-grandfather, who was enlisted to go and fight in German East Africa against the Germans. So again, it affected missions work because the men were being made to live where they normally functioned and lived and worshipped and were with their families, to go and fight in the war. Similarly, African men were recruited in the mines because due to the war, there was a lot of copper that was now being mined because of ammunition. And the great demand for copper implied that there would now be more need for digging it out of the ground. And therefore, men were taken from their villages and townships and so on, wherever they were, in order to go and work in the mines. So that in itself had a negative effect on the work of missions. But what was also happening at this point is that the mines were in the cities, they were in the towns. And so the men that were being brought out of the villages and out of rural areas to come and work in the mines were leaving their social environment behind. They were leaving their families behind to come and work in the towns, and the churches were not yet ready to minister to them. They were ill-equipped to do so. The best example I can give of this, which again is not helping us because it's a foreign situation, was when the Industrial Revolution began. With the starting of the Industrial Revolution, what happened was that many young men left the rural areas in Europe, in England, and even America. They left to go and work in the towns. They left their families behind, their parents behind. The social safety net was left behind. They went into the cities. They were basically like pieces of machine equipment. So they showed up in the morning, they did their work, they knocked off, and what they did in the evenings was none of the business of the owners of these huge companies. And the cotton mills especially, that were a major industry at that time. And what took place then is that they fell into the hands of prostitutes, into the hands of, or rather into drunkenness, and a lot of them were dying young. The churches were there, but the churches were not equipped, they were not ready to handle this huge influx of young people, young adults who were in town, and all they wanted was to get their paycheck, and that was it, and their socializing. It wasn't until, can I remember the gentleman's name now, who began the Young Men's Christian Association. Does anybody? Okay, I might remember the name shortly. He was a businessman, and he was a Christian, and he genuinely got concerned about the high turnover of the young men in his workplace, that he then challenged fellow businessmen to begin the YMCA. And basically it was primarily to answer the problem of these young men who were coming into the city. And all they did was to put up hostels. And in those hostels, they gave a condition. If you want to stay in these hostels, the price you pay is cheaper than everywhere else. No drinking, no girls, you attend Bible study. Basically, those are the conditions they gave. And out of that, a lot of young men started coming to faith in Christ, and the spiritual condition changed as a result of that. So, all that to say, the churches were not ready in Africa for that. And remember, it was quick, it was sudden, it was a lot of demand, and consequently, a lot of men coming into the townships. Result of that, inevitably, is a breakdown of the moral fiber of society, despite the fact that church is there. And I do want to make a comment there quickly before we bring in the next point. And it was the fact that the church is often the last place for change. We take long to think that society is changing, let's, the way a sailor does, when the ship uses sails, is that when the wind changes direction, the sailor changes the direction of the sails so as to keep going at the fastest rate possible. That's something that the church tends to be very slow in. And this is one of the effects of this. And so you end up in a situation where instead of the church growing in its impact, it's actually failing to do its job of the Great Commission. The last 3 points are a little bit of an indirect effect, because this is not really an effect but was happening at that time. African indigenous leaders took the place of missionaries who were kicked out. Now, as I said, this is not the effect of the First World War or the Second World War. It's simply the effect of the same period of time. Because during this period of time, you had the Pan-African movement, the initial leaders who had been raised in mission schools, who were now saying, hey, hang on, we need to rule ourselves. And basically what happened was that the atmosphere that was there in the world also went into the church as well. So why should we continue being led by you, the white man? Why? Because that's what's happening out in the society. We are also raising the same thing. And from my biographical reading, even the best of missionaries were suffered at the hands of this change of atmosphere as the movement towards independence was beginning to gain ground. Some of them in the process were even killed by the local people. Not because they've done something wrong, but because the atmosphere that is there in the world is also now coming into the church as well. I remember in Zambia, one of the things that happened in Baptist work was that because the missionaries of Baptist work, well, by that time there were also some from Europe, but the main association of churches, the missionaries were from South Africa. And South Africa was like, yeah, the devil in the thinking of the people within Africa. And so the missionaries were also suffering the same. Not just from the government, the moment they saw that they're from South Africa, but also from their own church members, the people that they had brought to Christ, who were now also treating them as bad and evil and so on. And so there was a great demand for them to leave and go back to South Africa. And because they did not think that the situation was mature enough at that stage, what they did was they made an appeal to the Australian Baptists in order for them to send missionaries to come and replace them. And so that's how the Australians came into Zambia as Baptist missionaries. So it was a very difficult time for missions work in that sense, because the atmosphere in Africa was just really charged. But inevitably what happens when you have an atmosphere that is causing people to disperse what happens when people disperse because of persecution or whatever? What happens when Christians disperse? Yes, they go preaching the gospel where they are going. And in due season, churches get planted even further afield. And that's what began to happen during this period as well. Part of it was the war itself, the wars, rather, the First and Second World War, which caused people to move around. But secondly, it was simply the people moving because of the changes that were happening within the context of Africa. And then lastly, the missionaries generally realized that the situation demanded indigenous leaders. Otherwise, the churches were going to suffer. And so there was an acceleration of the training of Africans for leadership. A real acceleration. And between roughly 1940 to about 1970, so that's a period of about 30 years, a lot of denominations brought Africans into the top leadership of the church and even handed over the leadership of not just local churches. They still had Africans as pastors of local churches, but in terms of leading the entire denomination, there was the training and handing over. And so a lot of Bible colleges were given a lot of attention in order to train top leadership. There was the bringing them into top leadership and then handing over to them as well. So those are some of the effects that took place at that time. And I'm hoping that what you are seeing here is continent-wide. Because at one time we were talking about West Africa, we're talking about South Africa, we're talking about East Africa, we're talking about Central Africa, and so on. Not so much North Africa, because up to now is still very, very difficult to function there. But I'm hoping that you can see that now we're just talking about Africa as a whole, that this is what was happening on the continent of Africa. Okay, any comments, any questions there? Yes? Yeah. What has tended to happen everywhere in the world is that when the pioneer missionaries have been kicked out, generally speaking, where it's been an evangelical work, not just Christianity by works, but evangelical work, is that the church has gone underground but grown. And then when the persecution is over, and then they come out from underground, the numbers are incredible relative to what they were before. So that's just been the case, even with the Chinese church, for instance. It's the same thing that has largely been discovered, although again it's being cramped down by the Chinese government. Yeah, anybody else? With respect to the effect, remember that this is something negative. War is always bad. Do anything to stop war, to stop fighting, because you lose lives, you damage property, and so on. And yet, the point we're seeing here is that it can also have its final positive effect. And those are the last few points that we have seen there. Yes? Yeah, that's a good learning curve. I never connected the Second World War to the liberation struggle. But I think there's something to be said for that, because the Second World War ended around 1945, and really it was in the next 10 to 15 years that you had this growth in the liberation struggle. And a number of countries began to be liberated mid-50s into the mid-60s, yeah. Wonderful. Anything else on the two world wars, and then also just the impact on missions, the world of missions? And I'm glad to hear of the Ethiopian connection to all this. As I said, in our part of the world, it was, there really was no fighting for independence. Nobody shot a single bullet at anybody during our struggle for independence. And that was primarily because of Kaunda's philosophy. And it was after Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy, which somehow he was seeing from Jesus's philosophy. In other words, instead of killing, he preferred that you just boycott things. And so it was the boycotting of a lot of things that was making Zambia to become ungovernable. There were one or two people that were killed, but the Kaunda leadership condemned the people who killed. In fact, one particular example, maybe the guys have even since died in prison. There was a lady who was traveling in a VW Beetle, a white lady and her children. And a crowd stopped, they put timber along the way so she couldn't drive anymore. And then they went and got the fuel from out of the tank, and they put it on top of the car, and they set it ablaze. And she died with her children. And the trial took place up until independence. And even after independence, that trial continued. And under the Zambian government, the individuals involved were sentenced to death, and then they were kept in prison. Then it was turned to life imprisonment. Since it was about 60 years ago, I think the guys have probably already died by now. But there was no armed struggle in our case, so ours was slightly different from everywhere else. However, Zambia brought freedom fighters from Southern Africa to be in Zambia, and they were fighting from Zambia. So Mozambique was made independent that way. Zimbabwe was made independent that way. Botswana was made independent that way. South Africa was made independent that way, and maybe other countries as well. So it was, we didn't fight, but we kept freedom fighters for that period.